Hi, I'm Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report. You know, everybody is concerned about Bitcoin being a Ponzi scheme, but in fact, it's the only thing out there that's not a Ponzi scheme. It's an open source project built by volunteers. It's not a Ponzi. But there are a lot of Ponzis out there. Stacy.
Yes, Max, we are coming to you again from Mexico, and this is our last episode in Mexico for so far this year, 2022. We head to El Salvador next, but I wanted to look at this headline from the website wolfstreet.com. It is not written by Wolf Richter, who is our guest in the second half, but he published it with a writer on his website, and the headline is called "The Problem with Ponzis." No, he's not talking about the US dollar in this particular case. He's talking about what he calls the Ponzi sector on the stock market, which is the .com 2.0, but they're kind of service companies like Peloton, a lot of the sector that boomed during the pandemic with all the free money pouring into everybody's stock accounts and all the Robinhood app thing, all the ones with fictional sort of income. Well, this is how he defines it. This is a whole grouping of companies that has no ability or desire to ever become profitable. Instead, these businesses have focused on rapid revenue growth because the stock market has rewarded them for this growth, especially if there are no profits. In reality, stock promotion is the core business of the Ponzi sector. It allows the companies to raise capital and fund unprofitable growth while insiders dump stock at insane valuations. Now, as this Ponzi sector equities go into free fall, a problem has emerged, and that is the down rounds, Max.
Right. So the underlying business model is troubling because in a lot of these companies, for every dollar in revenue, they're willing to spend $100 to obtain that dollar in revenue through marketing, for example, in the case of, let's say, a consumer product. And that obviously is the old joke about the guy who's trying to sell cookies at the bakery and loses on every cookie, but says he's going to make it up on volume, right? It doesn't work at the end of the day. The only reason it has perpetuated is that they could go to the markets and raise equity. The stock market was being fueled by 0% money. So you could go and sell stock to fuel your losing business proposition. And that's a Ponzi scheme. And what happens is eventually, like Bernie Madoff and any other Ponzi operator, that ability to get fresh money stops. And so it's like a train wreck. The people who then have to come up with more money to keep you from having to declare instant insolvency, they're going to say, wait a minute, we don't want to pay the same valuation we paid last month because it's now obvious that your access to capital is choked off. So give us a value that is more commensurate with what you really are worth. And of course, that is a down round. So they're saying, okay, we're going to have to bite the bullet, and everybody who put money in last time, they're going to be losing money. And then it starts a cycle of ratcheting down, like the .com crash of 2001. The NASDAQ, I believe, lost 90%. They lost $5 trillion, which is 90% of what the NASDAQ was worth back in 2001. I know $5 trillion is not a big number anymore like it used to be back in the early 2000s, but back then it was really something big.
So it's also important to note that Bernie Madoff operated an illegal Ponzi scheme. He set out to deceive and defraud. This is a sector which he is saying is Ponzi economics behind it. It's not, none of the companies are setting out to defraud anybody. They are offering a company service, they're offering a product, a service, and it's the investors who are valuing it at these Ponzi sort of prices.
Well, the granddaddy of all this was Amazon, right? So going back to the .com period, Amazon would lose spectacular buckets full of money every quarter to build this impregnable wall, anti-competitive wall that nobody could compete with them. And then Jeff Bezos started to report earnings finally, and now he's one of the richest men in the world. So that everyone thinks they're Jeff Bezos, and everyone thinks they have the next Amazon. Yes. But guess what? There's probably not going to be more than one Jeff Bezos in Amazon. There can't certainly be a whole NASDAQ full of thousands of them, and maybe just losing money means losing money.
That's right. And the article does bring up Amazon and say that everybody tries to be Amazon, and that's how they explain to their investors the losses. But during this period of high inflation, they're starting to really question whether or not this whole business model of Ponzi economics is possible. And he also points out that the way these Ponzi companies are going to have to grow their profits is actually to shrink, not to grow. And that's the opposite of what these sort of investors want. He writes that, now, I'm not saying Peloton, which he points out as being, their stock price is down 75% from an all-time high. He says it could go down a further 90% because the valuation is way over beyond what their actual subscription model brings in. He's saying, I'm not saying that Peloton has done anything illegal or immoral. I single it out because it doesn't seem to fit the model in most people's minds of a Ponzi, yet it is. Many of the most successful Ponzi sector stalwarts have been well-loved consumer products, led by people who genuinely believe they're improving the world. Investors rewarded them for growing fast, so they did. Now patience is running thin, especially when investors are losing money on multiple Ponzi sector investments simultaneously. Logic says that Peloton cannot grow into profits. It needs to shrink its way there. But that's going to be a nasty and highly dilutive journey.
Right, well, there's 2 points being made there. As far as shrinking your way down to sustainability, you need to show comparable earnings quarters or years, which can only happen on a capital base that is not being constantly inflated by selling stock off to fuel your money-losing business. And so where's the sweet spot where you can actually show quarter-to-quarter earnings growth on your business? For most of these companies, that doesn't exist. They're going to go bankrupt. Just like in the dot-com era, many companies just got squeegeed off the playing board. We never heard from them again. And that's going to be the case with this era of wonder stocks that are fueled. I mean, I saw a chart. There's something like 300 unicorns up from a year ago when there were 30. So that's just basically a bathtub full of broken toys. And then Elizabeth Warren and Congress filled it with water, liquidity at 0% money, and all those broken toys floated to the surface until the bond market and inflation starts to rear its ugly head. That's like pulling the stopper on the tub. Now all the water is draining out, and all the investors are looking and saying, you know what? All I see are broken toys. Why would I put any money into any of this garbage? Well, guess what? They're not going to.
You mentioned Congress, and that is part of, we had mentioned the likes of Bernie Madoff, the sort of Ponzi schemes that were illegal and set out with the intent to defraud, is that kind of Congress and the Fed have engaged in that in terms of the Ponzi economics of the entire stock market and the property markets. It's kind of a Ponzi scheme, is that they're pushing all this money with the intent of causing the asset prices to increase to make everybody feel good, and so that they spend more and that they vote more and they vote for their party. And so there is that, because you did see in the past year something extraordinary was just reported while we've been on vacation here in Mexico, and that was that $1.1 trillion was poured into the stock market this year from retail investors. And to put that into context, that was as much as the previous 19 years combined. That is part of the cause of the prices pumping.
Right, and you combine that information with what we're talking about here, is that these companies have no earnings.
Exactly.
As a matter of fact, they have losses. And they're just sustained by that illusion that Elizabeth Warren is responsible for of stock price go up based on fiat money creation. Now, when the illusion is popped, and then people say, hey, wait a minute, these companies actually have no earnings. You're going to have, as we've been saying, it's very predictable. You have a crash. That's what it's called. It's called a crash.
So there's something else that this model kind of reminded me of, and that is it's kind of the same model that empires go through. They expand because they have to grow, because they have an imperial population who wants to live like aristocrats. They expand and expand and expand until there's nowhere else to expand to. It becomes way too expensive to maintain that marginal unit of empire at the edge. And then it starts to fray. The cost is too high to maintain the cost of that one more subscriber to get your investors happy. The same thing with an empire, and the same thing we're having with the United States, I think, is like, and this guy's prognosis of that these Ponzi companies actually have to shrink to become profitable, is that's what always happens with empires, right? They have to shrink to become profitable again. But as he points out in this article, Ponzi's don't do that. They just expand, 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 and then collapse. And that's what you and I have been identifying in the US as this collapse of empire that we're seeing right now, is for the same exact business model, the same setup here.
Right. And, we've been talking about the military-industrial complex and the overreach of the CIA and the colonialization of Latin America and rigging elections overseas, been going on with the John Perkins model of Confessions of an Economic Hitman. Then they ran out of countries to overthrow. They overthrew 15 countries in Latin America. So they went after Americans. So for the past 20 years, the CIA has been spying on Americans. And the tech companies have been stealing money from Americans. So America is the new banana republic, according to the CIA. But now they've run out of Americans because they killed a lot of them through drug overdoses. There's not a lot of Americans left to steal from. So that's when the empire collapses.
So the insiders selling on these Ponzi sector stock markets. So he's saying it's just it's a stock scheme, right? It's a stock pumping scheme. And you've had the same over the last decade or two. When you look at the most powerful politicians in America, Trump was the only one that's a boomer. All the rest are actually silent generation. They're older than boomer. And they've been trying to maintain this float, this high valuation on their portfolio at the expense of the Generation Z, the Generation Millennial.
Right. Put this into context. The amount of money that was stolen from pension accounts by artificially keeping interest rates low was $5 trillion. So grandma and grandpa, they are missing $5 trillion of passive income that should have been in their retirement account at 4 or 5 or 5.5% income. That was taken down by Jamie Dimon and his friends to near zero so that they could take that $5 trillion and do a pump and dump scheme in the NASDAQ that Elizabeth Warren, even though her and the other one, Pelosi, trade on inside information and make money on, they're complaining about the people who run the companies that they give the free money to, that they're cashing out with their Ponzi scheme. And that's the end of empire. Adios, goodbye. We're not going to miss you. Don't shut the door on your way out.
Well, they need to shrink the empire of debt in order to save the viable parts of the economy.
You need to burn the village to save the village.
Which is the 18 to 45-year-olds. Those people, the number one cause of death, overdose, the number two cause of death, suicide. That should not be happening. That's a failed Ponzi economic model.
Britain did it right. They shrunk down, and now they're just, hanging out, and they don't care too much anymore. All right, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, much more coming your way. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to turn to Wolf Richter of wolfstreet.com. Wolf, welcome back.
Hi, Max. Thanks for having me back.
Now, you call it the most reckless Fed ever. That'd be the Federal Reserve Bank in Washington, D.C. Elaborate on why and how.
Well, the Fed is still repressing interest rates to near zero, and it's still printing money, even though at a slower rate than before. And it's doing so even while inflation, as measured by regular CPI, is now nearly 7%, and as measured by CPIW, which is for urban wage earners, it's over 7%. And there are no indications that this inflation will somehow go away on its own. I mean, this thing has started, the floodgates have opened, this thing is going. And the Fed is instituting the most negative real interest rates ever. And it's not really, it's brushed off in this inflation surge over the last 12 months. I've been ranting and raving about it, but the Fed doesn't listen to me. And so now we've got it. We've got these low interest rates. We've got this huge and surging inflation. And the Fed is now way behind the curve. Other central banks have jumped ahead of it. Now they've put in mega interest rate hikes over the past few months. And so the Fed is just gradually coming to grips with, or at least saying that it's coming to grips with the fact that this is not going away on its own. And this is just reckless. I mean, it's just totally reckless to do it that way.
Yeah, it's totally reckless. Well, how do you describe it exactly? So when the inflation comes in at these levels, the job of the Fed, one of the only jobs of the Fed, the reason it was created, is to raise rates when inflation gets to these levels. When inflation was at these levels last time in 1980, Paul Volcker raised rates to 15, 16%. As a matter of fact, inflation's running hotter than it was in 1980 when Paul Volcker raised rates to 16 or 17%. So he was doing the job of what the central bank should do. And people say, well, gee, that must have been painful. And yeah, it was, but it set the stage for the Reagan-Thatcher 80s revolution, if you will, and a great spate of growth. So I don't get it. I mean, if you had, I just don't understand it. They're not doing their job, and I don't understand how to describe it. Do we describe it that there's only a few choices? Either A, as you say, they're just recklessly out of control. B, there's some political machinations involved here. C, I mean, we have to consider that they might be under the control of a foreign power, right? Because they're doing something that's completely anathema to the health and safety of America.
Well, the biggest beneficiaries of this whole policy are the biggest asset holders. So those are, and maybe globally, but particularly in the United States, and those are the beneficiaries of this policy. Asset prices have surged because of the Fed's policies. And those that hold the most assets have benefited the most. So, that's where the beneficiaries are. Now we've got inflation, and inflation is hitting the purchasing power of labor. And so people are paying for this that never benefited from it. And I consider this reckless. I don't know whether it's political or not. It seems like Biden is going to have a huge, massive problem on his hands because of this inflation. And he's probably going to be begging the Fed to raise interest rates and do something about this thing because, the White House is going to get stuck with this. Again, it's going to get tarnished. It's going to get tarred and feathered with this inflation thing that we've got now. So, there is some of the politics in it, but I think it was just motivated by money. The Fed wanted to enrich the asset holders, and this policy is called the wealth effect. It's an official policy of central banks, and particularly of the Fed. And the Fed has discussed it many times in the past in papers. And so they have pursued this policy of the wealth effect, making the wealthy wealthier. And it worked. The wealthy got wealthier, a lot wealthier. And so now we've got this problem on our hands, and it's not going away.
Let's talk about Elizabeth Warren for a second. She's blaming greedy CEOs for inflation. Again, the question is, if she can't add 2 + 2 and come up with 4, she doesn't understand that debasing the money increases inflation. I don't think she's at core someone who with a less than a second grade education. I don't think she's dumb. I don't think she's functionally illiterate and a moron. I mean, she has to have a few brain cells up there. What's her story? Who is she working for?
Inflation is a psychological thing in addition to being a monetary thing. And the psychological thing is that people are paying those prices. And I've seen that in the new and used vehicle market a year ago. Suddenly people were starting to pay crazy prices for new and used cars. And those are discretionary purchases. People don't have to buy a new vehicle now. They can wait. They can drive what they have. Most people can drive what they have for another year. So this was discretionary. This was a decision they made to go ahead and pay those prices. So that's psychological. And that's when my fears about runaway inflation got triggered. When I saw that, and I came out of the car industry, so I watched that very closely. And so that's the first time in my life I've seen that people pay absolutely crazy prices voluntarily, eagerly. They're jostling for position to buy these vehicles at these prices. And I thought, oh my God, we're going to have a problem because the mindset has changed. The whole mindset has changed. And what blocks inflation is people refusing to pay those prices. And that didn't happen this time. Everybody's flush with cash and from this money printing binge, and companies are flush with money and they're paying the prices. without, without griping or trying to negotiate better deals. And so they're passing those price increases on. And yeah, it's, greed always motivates pricing decisions, but it's the resistance to price increases that keeps this greed in check. And that resistance just disappeared. Suddenly it's gone. There's no more resistance to price increase. Everybody's paying. Companies are paying, consumers are paying, everybody's paying, and government is paying. And so now we've got this situation where there is nothing to stop the greed. And greed is just half of the equation. You need to have the other half, which is resistance to higher prices. And that's fallen away. That's just disappeared. And that's what the Fed accomplished. And the government stimulus, and to some extent too, they destroyed any resistance among businesses and consumers to higher prices. And now we've got these price increases and they're running wild.
Yeah, I just don't get it. I mean, during the World War II, the Nazis airdropped British pounds or English pounds into England to hyperinflate the economy and to destroy the economy. Here, America and Elizabeth Warren are doing it to us, for ourselves. I don't understand why that's not considered heresy. I don't get it. Now, in the meantime, the wealth gains for Elon Musk wealth rose by $200 billion since the pandemic. Jeff Bezos, similar gains. The Fed's own data shows that's the 1% who have gained from the pandemic printing. Again, those assets are held outside of America and are untaxed. And yet Democrats continue to insist we need to print more. Again, this is a strategy used in World War II to destabilize countries, not to enhance countries. So they're using the same strategy used by our enemies in World War II to destabilize America. Have I missed something, or is wildly printing money into oblivion a good thing? Wolf, help me.
Well, I don't think this has anything to do with foreign interference here. Yeah, this is just a self-made problem. And, I think everything has gone out of whack now. And because of this dual stimulus from the federal government and from the Fed, and we're talking about $10 trillion in 22 months of stimulus, and fiscal and monetary stimulus. And something is going to break. I mean, we knew that something big was going to break after this kind of massive stimulus, and it broke. Now we have it. It broke, and I don't know how to. I mean, the way to fix it is you crack down on stimulus. You raise interest rates above the rate of inflation. You start unwinding the Fed's balance sheet to bring up long-term rates. I mean, we need long-term rates that are substantially above the rate of inflation. That means mortgage rates of 8 or 9%. That's what would crack down on inflation. Yeah, but that's not going to happen. So right now they're pussyfooting around it. They're going to raise a little bit next year, maybe, and then maybe a little bit more year after that. And it's not going to be enough. And so this inflation is just going to keep on dragging on.
The way to return to normal is to raise rates. I mean, there's a great video of me in Rotterdam from 3 or 4 years ago pleading for the Fed to raise rates to stop the insanity. It's gotten millions of views around the world. The answer is it's not a secret. The way to stem it is to raise rates. That's how the system works. It's like if you go to the barber because you want to get your hair cut, there's only one thing that's going to happen at the barber. The barber can cut your hair. The barber's not going to give you a foot massage to help you cut your hair, right? I mean, it's very axiomatic. It's the truth. There's no equivocation, Wolf. Rates now, it's been clear for 5, 6, 7 years. Rates have got to go up. And by not doing it, you're causing hundreds of thousands of Americans to overdose and to commit suicide. Wolf, they're monetizing suicide,
the connection
essentially.
Between interest rates and suicide is probably a little bit more indirect than that. But definitely rates should have never been this low to begin with. Interest rates should have never been below the rate of inflation. Inflation was running at 2% plus, based on CPI. So short-term interest rates should have been above that. And they were for a little while, and then the Fed cut them again. And long-term interest rates should have been much higher. I mean, this caused a whole bunch of problems. And since March 2020, of course, the problems have gotten a lot worse with this huge bout of money printing and the zero interest rates. And it's global. You know, it's hard for the United States to raise interest rates when the other major economies, such as in the Eurozone and in Japan and elsewhere, repress their interest rates to zero or into the negative. You know, they too have to raise their rates, and they too are responsible for the big issues we've got. Inflation is a global issue now. Asset price inflation is a global issue. And so it's in response to the central banks around the globe. And so, yes, lots of central banks have already started raising rates in mega steps. So the big ones have not. You know, the Bank of Japan has stopped QE in May, to its credit, so it stopped printing money. The ECB has now finally decided to cut in half its money printing, and the Fed's slowing it down a little bit. But you know, they haven't raised rates. They need to raise rates together. You know, they need to raise them by a lot. And I mean, inflation is even coming to Japan now, and that's amazing. But it's happening right now.
Well, we know those banks will start printing again soon. All right, Wolf. Well, thanks so much for being on Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
All right, that's going to do it for this edition of Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank our guest, Wolf Richter. Until next time, bye, y'all.